Good evening. My name is Shin-Yi Pai, and I'm the Program Director at Town Hall. On behalf of the staff at Town Hall Seattle and our friends at Third Place Books, it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's virtual presentation with Evan Osnos, who will be in conversation with journalist Eric M. Johnson. As we get underway, I would like to acknowledge our institution stands on the unceded traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, particularly the Duwamish. We thank them for our continuing use of the natural resources of their ancestral homeland. Thank you all for tuning in online. Town Hall is proud to be a community-based organization and a place where we can share and sustain ideas and creativity, both here in the beautiful Town Hall space and virtually. Town Hall will continue to produce virtual content as we launch into this new season, including our weekly podcast, In the Moment, which features exclusive guests, and many of our past talks are available in video or podcast form in our digital media library. Town Hall is adding new events and podcasts every day. Other upcoming programs include timely and critical topics like How to Talk to a Science Denier with Lee McIntyre and Becoming Abolitionists with Derica Purnell, Nikita Oliver, and Darnell L. Moore. Check our website or subscribe to our e-newsletter to get the latest updates as more programs are added throughout the season. If you share in Town Hall's vision for a robust community engaged in the arts, science, and culture where everyone has a voice, please consider supporting us tonight by donating or becoming a member. Visit our website for more info. But back to this evening's event. Tonight's presentation will be about 60 minutes, including Q&A. To streamline our audience experience, we've changed the Q&A platform for our events. To submit your question, please use your phone or computer to enter app.meet.ps/Osnos. We'll drop this link in the chat, and when we get to the Q&A portion, we'll remind folks again where to go. We can't guarantee that we'll be able to address every question, but we'll try to get to as many as possible. And please keep your questions concise and in the form of a question. For those who would like to view the program with closed captions, click the CC button in the bottom right corner of the video player. The program will be available for rewatching immediately following the event. Town Hall's work is made possible through your support and the support of our sponsors. Our Civic Series is supported by Real Networks Foundation, True Brown Foundation, the Norcliffe Foundation, the Neshholm Family Foundation, Caffin Foundation, and Wincote Foundation Northwest. Finally, Town Hall is a member-supported organization, so I'd like to thank all of our members watching from home. Lastly, you'll want to dive deeper into this evening's topic by purchasing a copy of the author's book. Please use the link in the chat below to pick up your copy through Third Place Books. Evan Osnos is a staff writer at The New Yorker, a CNN contributor, and a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. His first book, Age of Ambition, Chasing Fortune, Truth, and Faith in the New China, won the 2014 National Book Award and was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Wildland, The Making of America's Fury, is the subject of this evening's talk. Please join me in welcoming Evan Osnos.
Thank you very much. It's great to be with you. And I want to say thanks to Town Hall, especially for the invitation. I wish I was there in person, and I hope I have a chance to be back in person at some point. So, but thank you for signing on tonight. And Eric, thank you for signing on to do this conversation. It's fun to be doing it with you, particularly as a Chicagoan.
Of course, happy to be here, and congrats on the book again.
Thank you.
So why don't we dive right in? I would say one of the things I enjoyed most about your book was that you wove together this great memoir, but you also had vivid histories of the cities you lived in, and you actually spent quite a bit of time with real people following their journeys. What can you tell us about the genesis of this book? When did you decide to write it, and why?
You know, this is sort of a case of I have a set of tools as a correspondent, and you sort of know that experience, Eric, as a journalist. You know, if there are novelists who try to process the time we're living in using their tools, and then as a correspondent, and being a correspondent as a foreign correspondent is a very specific way of looking at places. I think if you kind of come up through Washington journalism, very often one thinks of things differently. I didn't come up through Washington journalism, actually. I really came up through this experience of going to places, living in foreign countries. I was, you know, very fortunate to be first a national correspondent in the US, and then was sent overseas. And I'd studied Chinese for a long time before going overseas. And I always wanted to go to China. So I went to China, and I sort of acquired that, I suppose, the habits of mind of trying to understand how a country is at a certain moment in its history, and what are the cross currents, what is shaping it, what's defining it. And I always felt like that the remedy against abstraction was to write about individual lives and to say, I'll always have these ideas in the back of my mind, but I have to find what's actually happening in somebody's life, because in a sense, the conceptual is sort of the retreat. And in a way, it's very familiar to us. We're all conceptualizing this period in American life. And what I could do is actually say, no, why don't I really need to sort of go out and do the shoe leather version of trying to understand what's happening, which is simply to go listen to people and find out how are these different lives in the United States coexisting in such different ways. So it's a very long, I'm afraid, kind of convoluted explanation for something quite simple, which is that when I came back to this country after being abroad for a decade, I said the only way I'm really going to understand what it means to be in the United States at this point in its history is to try to capture the sheer breadth of experience of being American now.
Sure.
So that was the genesis.
That makes a lot of sense. And I mean, I have to say, reading it, there were times I felt like I was reading an obituary for America. And you look at the cities that you focus in on, you have Chicago, you've got redlining, racism, segregation, gun violence. You go to Greenwich and you have this sort of obscene wealth that's, sprawling into various issues like the SAT testing scandal, which is for one example. And then, the opioid crisis in coal country. And so, when you were looking at all of these, extremely pernicious trends and changes in these cities, I mean, did you see it as an obituary, or did you see it, were there glimmers of hope, or themes or people that kind of gave you some hope for the future?
Yeah. Actually, I mean, it's interesting. I think one could argue that there is always whenever, at every point in the history of the United States, whenever you drop into it, one could find reasons to celebrate where we are and to mourn either what we have not yet acquired or what we have lost. And I'm sort of mindful of that. I was I was thinking, like, when Upton Sinclair was writing about the United States, was he sort of, mourning of the loss of something, or was he also, was he raging against the fact that something was not there? And I'll talk in a moment about the three places. Oops, I think, hold on, we've gotten all fuzzy. I'll see if I can make myself unfuzzy. All right, now we'll see if I'm back and I'm unfuzzy. So I think I'll talk about the three places in just a second. But there was actually this very clear model for what I was doing. I was sort of thinking a lot about one book in particular, Eric, which is this book by a guy named John Gunther, who was an American foreign correspondent who lived overseas, particularly in the 40s. He covered the wars in Europe and in the Pacific. And he came back, he was from Chicago, came back to the United States. And as he described it, and I mentioned this in the book, he felt, as he said, like a man from Mars, because he felt out of step. He didn't quite understand where the country was and what it was doing. And his sort of tool, his methodology was quite literal, where he went from every state and he went around. And for people who are interested in this kind of literature of the United States, John Gunther's book, which was called Inside USA, just received this totally rapturous recollection recently, written by Robert Gottlieb in the New York Times, and Robert Caro is a huge fan. There's a thing. If you go and you look online, by the way, the book, ever since Gottlieb wrote about it, has now become like impossibly expensive on Amazon. But this was a huge sort of document for me. I was just impressed by the documentary nature, just going around and trying to write about people's lives. And what I realized when I came home was I had spent these years abroad talking to people in authoritarian countries like China, like Egypt, like Iraq, about the United States. And I had said, look, we will make big errors, big mistakes. We have never fully inhabited the values that we aspire to, and yet we aspire to them. And there are some big basic moral ambitions, like the rule of law, the power of truth, and ultimately the idea that you can, in fact, make a better life for yourself. And I came back to the United States, and I need to bracket that with some pretty clear limitations. This has always applied mostly to white, male, straight people. I'm sort of like that has to be described. And it's also true, though, that we had lost some of those attributes that had been so essential to our self-narrative. So when I came back, I was kind of thinking a lot about how can I actually measure what has been lost and what has been gained, what is new and what is old. And I knew as a reporter, I think, and you've had this experience too, where we drop into a new place and it's fine. You can get a snapshot by talking to enough people. But what I couldn't do was chart change over time. And so if I wanted to do that, I needed to go to places that I really knew. I mean, places where I'd spent time in my life. And so that's how I chose these three very different places, which you mentioned. And it's for people who haven't read the book, it's Greenwich, Connecticut, which is a prosperous suburb of New York City, where I grew up as a kid, and Chicago, where I lived for a number of years. I was a reporter at the Chicago Tribune, and Clarksburg, West Virginia, which is a small city in the northern part of the state, where I had my first job out of college. I was a sort of really terrible photographer, actually, at the Clarksburg Exponent Telegram. But it's a place that means a lot to me. It kind of got under my skin, and I've been going back to West Virginia and writing about it ever since. And so if I said I have these three places, they will show me something. And if I can be smart enough to close my mouth and listen.
Yeah, and I think we can start with Greenwich. You grew up there, you know it well, and you sort of saw its transformation. You also returned to it. So you wrote, as the fortunes in Greenwich climbed, a pattern emerged. After residents had secured the major markers of wealth, the home, the right schools, the serenity of private aviation, they turned their attention to the real game in town, the refining of advantage, the expansion of the margins, the hedging against trouble, real and imagined. If you knew where to look, you could home every edge of your life, from the your life expectancy to tax avoidance, to your child's performance in the SATs. You could, in other words, make sure that the winners keep winning. So part of your Greenwich chapters are anchored by the tale of Chip Skullrock, who is this he's a doctor who decides to go into hedge funds. And so I wanted to start with, what was it about his story that drew you in? Why was he sort of emblematic of what you were seeing more broadly in your home city?
Yeah, and thank you for that, by the way. I don't want to flatter you, but that is sort of that graph right there. I mean, those couple of sentences from my perspective are sort of the absolute beating heart of the book, because I really came to see that as one of the primary facts of our time, was that we have engineered systems that allow us to maximize the possibility of staying on the winning side of the human divide. And in a way, there's something there's something quite damaging, actually, to the American ethic of the idea that you can be insulated from your own mistakes, ultimately. Which leads me to the subject of Chip Skowron, which is an interesting one. So I have to give a little bit of context, which is he so I after the financial crisis, there was, as we remember, of course, one of the primary facts of the United States and our politics was the fact that people felt as if there was never real accountability for the financial crisis, and that some of the people responsible were never really held to account. And that was the origins, in many ways, of a lot of the politics that I think we see today, both on the left and on the right. And yet there was also this fascinating phenomenon that in my hometown, a town that I sort of think of both with affection and concern, there was this pattern of prosecution. There were people who were getting arrested for doing terrible things, financial crimes. Like there was a guy named Raj Rajaratnam who was a hedge fund manager who lived up the street, who was sent to prison, who was the longest insider trading sentence in American history. And there was other of these cases. It was at one of the people who was a feeder for Bernie Madoff lived just down the way. I mean, And it was like this bizarre pattern, Eric, because I was like, what is going on? I mean, another person who lived down the street eventually was one of the people in the college admissions scandal. He paid $75,000 to change his daughter's ACT results. And there were so many people who were breaking the law that actually somebody in town, a blogger, nicknamed our street. Our street's called Round Hill Road, and he nicknamed it Rhodes Hill Road. And so I thought, what happened? I mean, when did this become? When did what has to be described as a culture of transgression, this idea that people were playing it fast and loose, so close to the line? How did that happen?
Right.
And so I went looking to try to find an example of a life that, as you know, as we often say, you know, don't try to tell me the story of man, try to tell me the story of a man, or, you know, to modernize the sentiment, a person. And that concept is really important. I said, if I can get inside somebody's motivations and what happened, then maybe I'll be able to understand a little bit of the sort of, I suppose, the interior logic of the era of radical inequality. That's honestly what I was fascinated by. Chip Skowron's an interesting guy. He was trained as a doctor. He was a very sort of successful doctor. He was a young surgeon who, you know, got his degree from Yale, got his PhD right away, was going off to Harvard to be a fellow, and he was losing interest in medicine. He knew nothing about finance. He actually, at some point, somebody said to him, you know, you should think about going to Wall Street. And he knew so little about Wall Street that he bought a book called Getting Started in Hedge Funds. And that was the extent of his knowledge of hedge funds.
Great.
And he ends up going off and joins a firm and run by a resident of Greenwich. And Greenwich at this point was becoming very kind of central to the hedge fund era. It became known as the hedge fund capital of the world and so on. Anyway, Chip ended up going from one fund to the next, eventually started his own, made tens of millions of dollars, and then also started breaking the law and started paying I don't want to give the whole story away because it gets pretty interesting. But what happens is he finds himself over the course of this brief period of time going from being essentially a sort of high-flying doctor to being somebody who is handing envelopes of cash to a researcher in a hotel bar. And I was just absolutely fascinated by that. Because in a sense, that's also a window into the crisis of credibility of American institutions and of capitalism itself in the eyes of many, particularly younger Americans. So running beneath this whole inquiry was essentially this question of how is it that we created systems that are so optimized for the accumulation of advantage that we've actually begun to undermine the credibility of those systems themselves.
Right. And I was if you don't want me to give away too much about his story, I'm going to switch to Clarksburg.
All right. I'll tell you, it was Colonel Mustard in the drawing room with the lead.
Okay. So one of the things that was so fascinating about Chip and astonishing really is like, so you come back to him and it presumably was after, you know, years after, or at some point you interviewed him later about sort of, and he's giving these, he's explaining himself in some way. So here's the quote. So you ask him to basically what do you think about what you did? And he says, when he paused and thought about his behavior, he alternated between being ashamed and coolly cynical, was paying for sex or stock tips, the scandal that people made it out to be. Quote, it's a pattern that we live with all the time that we just mask in different ways, he said. What do you think Tinder is? So it was this fascinating like oscillation between this clear awareness of like, yes, I crossed the line. I made morally bad decisions, but then kind of everyone's doing it. So it was
and
interesting.
That, you know, and you hit the nail on the head, Eric, because after all, I mean, the name of the chapter is Everyone is Doing It, because that is this undertone. And the reason I think that's so interesting is that so much of what governs our behavior as a society is our perception of what others are doing. And it gets to the point if others are getting the vaccine, I'm much more likely to get the vaccine. And if I'm surrounded by people who are questioning the science of it, I'm much less likely to get it. And so those kinds of effective evaluations, essentially, what others are doing is the soft tissue of of American life. And so I sort of look at it in the context of Greenwich, and I also look at it in the context of other places, because in a way, I think sometimes, the story that I'm describing, which is this period of, what I describe as the sort of generation of American fury, is a combination of both structural systemic failures and also these kinds of normative cultural failures, the ways in which we have gradually been absorbed by understanding, by expectations, by cruelties, hostilities. I mean, like when you go online and you see that everybody is cutting everybody else to ribbons on Twitter, the natural assumption is, I guess that's how we treat each other now.
Right.
And so, I'll climb down from my soapbox for a second, but I just sort of feel like that was one of the things I was trying to capture, which you went right to the heart of it, which is these decisions about what we consider to be okay. And there are part of going abroad and coming back home is that when you come home, you look at things and you say, wait, how did that get okay? That's not
right.
Not okay. That can't be okay,
Right. And Chip's story is fascinating. I for people who haven't read it, we'll change topics, but it's,
well,
I think anyone who has
I don't mean to steer you away, because
anyone who
I'll talk about it anyway.
Yeah. So Clarksburg. So you lived in Clarksburg. You moved there as a fledgling photographer, but you wanted to write. A reporter for a local paper. And I'll read a short excerpt about what you sort of how you had seen the community change. So in Clarksburg, my mind often returned to Trump's nostalgic mantra, "Make America Great Again." The word nostalgia is derived from the Greek for home and for pain. And for years, West Virginia had been steadily losing a sense of home while gaining a sense of pain. City records show that nobody in Clarksburg had embarked on a construction of a new building in 5 years. More than a century after Kennedy had considered Clarksburg important enough to stop there on his campaign for president, the sidewalks and storefronts during this election were silent. Nobody was coming. Banners hung from lampposts with the slogan, "Proud Past, Unlimited Future," but it was hard to conjure any image of that future except for a hollow promise of reviving the past. And so when you return to Clarksburg later, when you were researching for the book, and I think if I recall right, you saw your apartment building, but the windows were boarded up.
Yeah.
And so I just, talk about the how the community had changed and what sort of seeing how did it get to where it was when you came back to that?
Yeah. I mean, the fascinating thing about Clarksburg, West Virginia is, it was founded in a spirit of great ambition. It was this place that was created here in, this is what's known as North Central West Virginia. So it's, an hour or so, basically 45 minutes south of Morgantown, if I'm trying to orient people who might know the area. And it was created. They wanted it to be the Athens of the Allegheny, was how the original founders described it, meaning like a cultural and political place. And there's these wonderful travel records of visitors from the 19th century who said, this little town doesn't have more than 10 buildings, but they treat themselves as if it is a place of real substance and significance. And I love that about it. When I first came, it was a place that was built up. I mean, it has tall buildings that are sort of corniced, like you would find in an old industrial northeastern city. And you drive in out of the mountains, and you come in and you see this place. It's only got a population of about 16,000 people, but it had this wonderfully ambitious newspaper. I mean, that was the thing. The thing that brought me there was that I was hired by this newspaper that put out 2 papers a day. I mean, imagine that, Eric, for like 16,000 people. There was a morning paper and an evening paper. And they weren't just 2 editions. They were separate newspapers that competed, and often in many cases, like they had different editorial positions. And there was just something glorious about that. And so Clarksburg used to have there was a billboard that used to hang in town that said, "You have a right to be proud." And it was a place that was, I mean, strictly speaking, actually pretty well endowed economically. Like it had these glass factories that were growing and growing. And over the course of the second half of the 20th century, it had moments of a real lift. It was kind of following the arc of the accumulation of sort of rising income for the working class. It was never rich, but it was stable and it was growing. And there was that feeling about it. You have a right to be proud. And I think the thing that really struck me when I came back after being abroad was a feeling of sclerosis, the sense of a place that had been on this kind of escalator for a couple of 100 years, not in a dramatic way, but inching along, had found itself somewhat kind of marooned in, and there were pockets of things happening. There was a new science and technology park out by the highway and stuff, but it had lost, just empirically, all the measurements showed that it was losing something. And I think when I went by my old apartment building in 2014, and I saw, this was the opioid epidemic was sort of gathering steam. And I remember looking up at my apartment and the window was broken and there was a kind of sheet over the window and it was flapping in the breeze. And it was just one of those small indicators, like a little moment that I said, something is amiss and I need to figure out what happened here. And, and that was still a couple of years before Donald Trump entered our politics, but I was beginning to make out the contours of that thing which you described, that sense of that longing for what has been lost. And really at the heart of it, and I don't use the word in that paragraph, but this is really about dignity. It's about a sense of losing some of the things that make you, that give meaning to a community. And, I wanted, if you'll indulge me 1 second on this interesting point, you mentioned the Kennedy thing, and I think it's worth giving the context because people might find it interesting. In 1960, John F. Kennedy was running for president, and he visited Clarksburg. Clarksburg, it mattered on the political map. He was in West Virginia. It was a very important state for him because he had to demonstrate that a Catholic Democrat could, in fact, get the nomination. So not only did John F. Kennedy come to Clarksburg, but so did Bobby Kennedy and Teddy Kennedy and Jackie Kennedy and Hubert Humphrey and Lyndon Johnson. I mean, this place was like on the political map. And Jack Kennedy, amazingly, Eric, he went on local television for 30 minutes and answered questions from local people. And I asked folks at the Historical Society over the years, I said, who else after that? Which other presidential candidates, Democrats, came? And they said, the truth is, actually, we can't find any evidence of other Democratic presidential candidates coming. And what had happened was, as Clarksburg was losing, partly the unionization was falling off. It was losing its significance. And as that happened, people didn't have a name for it. They couldn't quite put their finger on it. But that was part of this extraordinary transformation in which West Virginia went from being essentially Democratic territory when I was there to being now, obviously, one of the most conservative, most reliably, essentially Republican pieces of terrain. And that fascinates me about what happened and why people suddenly gravitated to, let's be honest, a presidential candidate who was lying to them about what he could do. And, Donald Trump put on a miner's helmet and went to West Virginia and he said to people, you're going to be working your asses off. I'm going to put you back to work. And that was a lie. It was a total fabric. It was just nonsense. I mean,
the job numbers went down for coal miners.
Right. Coal jobs. I mean, they lost another 6,400 coal jobs over the course of the Trump presidency. So,
but one of the positive anecdotes from those chapters that I thought was very informative was the Klan rally.
Yeah.
How the community rallied against it. So they had people come out and, the Klan had a few people or whatever, but then, you write how the counter rally across town drew hundreds, and then the Exponent Telegram, which was your paper, you had the member of the editorial board writing, we journeyed a little farther on the road to a truly free society. And then you write, in the weeks afterward, the city installed a sign on the road into town, welcome to Clarksburg, we celebrate diversity. So
it was thrilling. I mean, that's a thing that happened in like 99, 2000. And that was this period when it really was this exciting moment. And so part of the reason why I note that is to show like that the sort of moral ambitions of the place they run deep. And that's all the more reason and sort of why it becomes fascinating to wonder how it is that Donald Trump was able to galvanize people's attention And I think part of the reason comes to that thing I was hinting at earlier, which is that they began to feel as if others weren't listening. There's in a sense, a sort of a way in which political attention is more powerful than we sometimes think. And even though, and I had, in the book, I quote a guy named David Efaw, who was a coal miner, who said, look, I didn't entirely believe what Donald Trump was saying, but he was talking to us. He was talking.
Right. Yeah, I know. You remind me of a conservative friend I have who said, I don't like the captain, but I like where the ship's going, kind of thing. So
right.
But
and exactly. Yeah.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
No, I think it's one of the interesting things that I say this is not a huge revelation, but I'm a liberal Democrat, and one of the things that we struggle with as writers is that question of people voting against their own interests. And I always, I've had people say to me in West Virginia that the problem is that it really bothers people to be told that they're voting against their own interests. That you can have an analytical conversation,
yes,
but it drives people nuts to be told, because there's something fundamentally sort of dismissive about it. And I've had Democrats in West Virginia say, we need to stop this,
Right, and so one of the anecdotes, which is great, and we'll get back to the serious stuff in a second. But so you tell this story about the iPad, which I know Good Morning America asked you about it. Probably everyone does, but as a father with two young kids, very spirited kids, sometimes you got to go to that iPad, right? So just tell the story from start to end, and then, but you have to also talk about the very unusual response to it that you were seeing online.
Yeah, this was, my first encounter with the World Wide Web in its full capacity. But,
right.
This is as a dad, you'll recognize this. But when we have the iPad, it was sitting around, and our then 3-year-old Oliver, who treats this thing like a talismanic object. Anytime he can get his hands on it, he just starts pounding away, trying to get into it, trying to open the passcode. And he tried so many different numbers that eventually, when I found it, and he gave up, he didn't get in. But when I found it, it said, you've been locked out. It said disabled for 25 million minutes, which works out to 48 years. And I was like, oh my God, this is a serious problem for the iPad. So then I put it, and I just tweeted, I said, does anybody know how to fix this? I assumed this would be a very common problem. And I got some very helpful, I got some very helpful tweets. But the thing kind of went viral because I think people had a lot of fun with the idea that we were locked out for 48 years.
Right.
And then it took on this totally bizarre turn, which is that people began to they assumed that this was like a vast fraud, that we had created this thing as a way of like attracting attention, or maybe making money somehow, or like casting aspersions on Apple. And I started getting these fascinating like conspiratorial tweets.
Right.
And so I was like, I want to talk to these people who assume this is some vast kind of,
conspiracy.
And I contacted them. I was like, just out of curiosity, like, what makes you think that this is a conspiracy? And they're like, well, I've seen things like this on the internet of people doing. You'd be shocked what people will do. And it was actually quite fascinating. And they were incredibly kind to sort of engage my query on this. But the takeaway from my perspective, Eric, which I think is really relevant in the broader politics, is that we have been sort of acculturated over time to be on guard, to be suspicious, to be cynical of any kind of suggestion of authority, or not authority, or anything that might have the aroma of deception about it. And it reminded me of something that I had set aside when I was working in China, which is this quote from Hannah Arendt, who is the great chronicler of the mindset of living in a world also in which you are being subject to deception. And what she described was what she called a peculiar form of cynicism that takes hold when you come to believe that you are being deceived all the time. And she said, eventually what happens is that you stop believing anything. And in China, that was totally relevant to me because people grow up with the understanding that essentially the state media is lying a lot, and so they don't believe it, and that creates this broader suspicion. But in the American internet context, what's happened is that because we're sort of all of us aware of the ways in which the tools of technology are this double-edged sword in which we are, vulnerable and sort of unprotected, there is this creeping and encompassing sense of cynicism. And I think you see that as, I saw it as precursors to the sort of epistemological problem we're dealing with now, which is people just fundamentally do not believe things, no matter how credible, no matter,
right,
no matter how authenticated, how tested by science. And that was a really revealing little moment.
Right. And to pivot off that, I'll ask one more and then we'll go into the Q&A. But, you have a quote late in the book that is, it's pretty bleak, but it really stuck with me. So you said, across American life, we had refined a set of extraordinary tools for building wealth, firing bullets, and circulating information that were so powerful they altered not just the arrangement of American politics, but also the chemistry of it. The AR-15 was as different from a musket as a hedge fund was from a Wall Street bank in the Victorian age. The disinformation on Facebook was not just a digital version of a pamphlet handed out by the John Birch Society. It was, in the wrong hands, a super spreader of lies, engineered with all of the power that Silicon Valley could marshal. Taken together, our latest tools were differences of kind, not degree, and they were pushing America to the breaking point. And so when you actually talk to people in this book who were prepping for like a serious amount of civil disorder, survivalists and that sort of thing. And so when you think about the breaking point, all of the reporting you've done, what does that look like? Is that people in the streets? Is that a second civil war? I mean, where do you think we're going down this path?
Yeah, I actually, and this is interesting because having, I covered the storming of the Capitol on January 6th as a reporter for the New Yorker. I was there, there at the Capitol watching this, what I think for all of us was a pretty devastating sight to discover our own, the seat of American democracy being picked apart by people who were in the grip of a delusion. I mean, that's the only way to understand it, honestly. And talking to people on that site was a reminder of just how thorough the delusion was and how committed people were to it. And yet, you know what, Eric, this is a funny thing. I've spent over the last few years in the course of the research for this book and in my work at the New Yorker, I've done things like spend time, as you mentioned, with these preppers and with people in the gun world. And actually at the end of it, and of course, we've now spent the last 18 months in the grip of the horrors of COVID. And yet at the end of it, I come away with it quite persuaded of the resilience of society, which is not just I'm not making a blandly sunny point. What I'm actually saying is like, these guys who sort of have these fevered imaginings that suddenly they're going to find that their house is overrun and they're going to have to come storming out with their AR-15. That is like, it's like a costume of the mind that they allow themselves. It's sort of a refuge that they can go to, and it comforts them in a moment of anxiety. But that's actually not how the pandemic unfolded. In the pandemic, we saw these systemic cruelties, which I write about at some length. But we also saw people more or less muddling through and doing what they could, and not the implosion of society. And I remember after I'd published this piece about preppers, I was getting a lot of email from readers during the pandemic saying, "Hey, what happened? Did the preppers end up, going to New Zealand or not?" And and one of the things, I was talking to a couple of the guys who had been doing that kind of preparations, and they'd said, "Well, now, in the end, I just actually we went to Tahoe. It was fine. Like, we just kind of holed up with the kids." And I sort of took that. I don't know. I found the sort of the banality of it quite comforting. Even though in the mind we tend to we sort of retreat to the most exotic scenario, and there's a long running tradition of that in American letters, but at the same time, we found ourselves towards something closer to I don't want to go so far as to say mutual aid, because it was very sort of place specific, but you saw people doing things that may have even surprised themselves in terms of their willingness to bet on their fellow citizens. And that's very encouraging, actually.
Right. Lindsey Graham's, you mentioned his speech from the Senate floor where, he talks about, count me out, that sort of dynamic.
Well, I mean, like Lindsey Graham is just, I don't know. Don't get me started on members of the Congress.
Okay. Good time for the Q&A then.
I was going to say, if you want to get leaked, let's talk about the U.S. Congress. All right, sorry.
Right. Seriously. So let's see. First question. How has your book been perceived with different parts of the country? Have you experienced any severe backlash?
No, but that's always a prospect, I suppose. I think, I guess part of it is, it's not the book is not an indictment really, as much as it is an attempt to describe. And so I suppose there will be people who don't like it, and there are people who will agree with it. But it's within the bandwidth of how I generally write about places in the New Yorker. And so my hope is that people take it for what it is, which is an attempt to reckon with the period in American life, an attempt to sort of put it on paper. I go back to that, John Gunther, who I was talking about before, who, his approach was a little more sort of statistical. He would compile things like how many bushels of wheat were being produced in Kansas in a given week and stuff like that. I was doing essentially the 21st century version of that, which is trying to take stock of how our modern tools, what the effect of it was. And so some people will find something probably that they disagree with in there, and some people won't. But so far I've been actually quite encouraged by the reaction.
Yeah. Oh, well, great. And the next question is, if you were to live in 3 other areas that weren't Greenwich, Connecticut, or West Virginia, what places would you study to create another authentic story like this one?
That's really interesting.
Apart from Seattle, of course, which is on top of your list.
You're right. Shameless pandering right there. Good job. It would be Seattle, and Seattle, actually, Eric. I'm glad you mentioned. And now, I should point out, this book is kind of geographically delinquent because there is nothing in the Pacific Northwest. And, but yeah, I've always been, going back to when I was a teenager, I've just been sort of fascinated by Alaska, and it's a piece of the American character in a funny way. And when I applied to work at the Clarksburg Exponent Telegram, one of the other places I applied was Homer, Alaska. And the photographer at the paper there wrote back very friendly, but he said, the only problem is you're going to arrive in January and it's dark. So it's not great for photos. And so I was like, okay, fair point. And, but no, I suppose I'm interested in some of the extreme territories. I've always been interested in the islands off the coast of Maine, and
oh, nice.
I suppose that leaves Texas. So then Texas. Then we got to move.
Okay.
I'm a
so
big
Maine, Alaska, and Texas. Yeah. Got it.
And it's a literary question too, in a sense. And if I can suggest one piece of reading that's resonant with what I'm trying to do here, is Lawrence Wright, who's a colleague at the New Yorker, wrote a book called God Save Texas, which is just a gorgeous description of place. And by that, I mean the politics and the culture of place. And so I was kind of fascinated by it.
Next question is, and I had one thought similar to this, because your book it's so personal, and you spend, what's the total time? Was 6 years that you were doing the research for this? Yeah. And so you're plumbing the depths of very difficult topics. And so the question is, during the writing process, did you ever find yourself wanting to stop? What made you keep going?
Oh, no, I never wanted to stop, actually. I procrastinated a little bit by writing a book about Joe Biden, but that's a separate matter. No, I was desperate to, this book felt to me like a kind of emergency. And I felt this really strong sense that, because this was honestly like me trying to reckon with my own country and trying to figure out what had happened and how did we get into this moment. And the single moment, if I was really going to identify the moment when I realized what I was writing, I'd been starting on it, tinkering on it before this, but it was in the summer of 2015 when I was watching the first Republican presidential debate. It was August, and I was watching it in the home of some Trump supporters in Ohio, and one of them was drinking out of a swastika coffee cup, and he's a white nationalist. And I said, how did this happen? That the person who was on his way to being the Republican presidential nominee was somehow had ushered this guy out of his out of his slumber and had brought him back into feeling as if he could talk about that in front of a reporter, which is a fascinating sort of barrier to have crossed in American life. So at that point, it felt grave. I mean, not to be too dramatic about it, but, I'm the son of Jewish refugees to the United States. And so this matters to me. And I was just sort of fascinated by that. And so, no, I never thought for a moment that this was not something I needed to finish.
Right. And another question is, how did the pandemic change your book, if at all?
Well, in a weird way, it was, there's sort of two ways to answer the question. One is conceptually, and the other one is in terms of craft. If there's writers who are interested in sort of how do you do a closely observed nonfiction book when you can't leave your house? I mean, that's an interesting puzzle. And part of it was, I think if I'd been earlier in the book, it would have been a disaster, because then I would not have been able to meet people. But by that point, I was already pretty deeply involved in people's lives and had been following them for a long time. And they sort of knew what we already had a pretty good understanding of one another. And so we could be in a lot of contact, and I could find out how their lives were evolving. And then eventually I was able to go to all these places again after a period of time. But on the conceptual level, actually, it was in its own way sort of, I'd say this kind of with sadness, but it was proof of concept, which was that what I was describing was this pulling apart of the country. And the COVID turned out to be like an X-ray of our underlying weaknesses. You could sort of see the fractures in the bones, and you could see the hollowing out, because you began to see, for instance, that communities of color had been overwhelmingly affected by the virus in ways that prosperous white communities were not. And part of that was because of pre-existing conditions, and part of the phenomenon of living in neighborhoods like the ones I described, particularly on the south side of Chicago, where kids were much more likely to have asthma because of their proximity to highways, and because of the fact that you have to stay inside more. It's harder to play outside because it's not as safe. All of these factors ended up suddenly in the era of COVID. It was like they were sort of pulled up to the surface, and you had these ways of measuring the effects. And so, in a way, I'd assumed that the book would actually end with the pandemic, because it seemed like this demonstration of some of the accumulated troubles that were at the core of this wildland phenomenon I was describing. And then January 6th happened, and it was just so clearly the punctuation point at the end of the sentence.
And after your 8 years in Beijing, how did you feel about coming back?
Well, I probably would have stayed abroad for longer, except that my wife, Sarah Beth, who is a much more sort of socially well-adjusted human being, she said, if we stay abroad too long, we're never going to be able to come home. And she was right about that. She said, we're going to just fall out of step with the United States. And then I came to see it actually in a sort of thrilling way, which is, oh, wait, this is going to be like a new place to me, because I've been gone so long. And she was right, of course. And we did come back. There was a little bit of getting used to. I mean, we went from Beijing, we used to live in a sort of traditional Chinese courtyard house, which was, we shared a wall with a 700-year-old Confucian temple. And we came back here, and the first night we spent in the US was at our, in our in-laws' house in the suburbs. And I was just sort of like, these are non-overlapping human experiences.
Right.
But, and then I will tell you that, but then there were some little tiny indicators that there was just a powerful story that I realized almost immediately that we'd sort of come into, which was a couple of things. Number one, in Washington, where we had moved, Washington, D.C., the average white family was 81 times richer than the average black family in one city, 81 times. I mean, there was a level of, and the numbers were spreading, and it was quite, you began to see that there was this way in which and this was the capital, and it was a way in which there was an undescribed phenomenon that was reaching a breaking point. And, this was before the advent of the Black Lives Matter movement. It was obviously before George Floyd, but the numbers themselves began to tell you that there was a problems of racial injustice that were reaching the point when it was going to be very hard to see America as anything but in a state of crisis. And so Washington, in its own way, turned out to be kind of the natural place to begin to peel that onion, I think.
What are you most proud of in your book?
Oh, I don't know about that. That's not a sensation that occurs to a writer very often, I have to say. I mean, I think, what would you say, Eric? I mean,
that's a tough one. Yeah, it's like you always, no matter, how done something is, even after it's published, you're always like, I would have done that maybe a little different, or I should have expounded on that.
Totally.
That's part of it. Yeah.
I mean, as you know, you don't finish it, you just abandon it. I mean, that's
right. Exactly.
And
let's see.
Can I say, actually, there's one sort of weird way to answer that, which is an honest answer to that. And it's something I put at the very end of the book, which is that when we started on this, I didn't have kids. And over the course of researching and writing this book, we've had 2 kids. And so I was having this strange oscillating sensation between writing about American politics in the years of Donald Trump, which is, about as, I don't know, cheerful as, grinding your face against a piece of sandpaper. And then we'd come home and have these moments of like sort of ecstatic awareness that comes with having like new kids arriving. And the combination of those two was quite bracing, because what I realized by the end of the book was that I was really writing this book for my kids. I ended up dedicating it to them because I wanted them to know about this period in American life when I felt like the country was really sort of drifting broadside to our own judgment of ourselves, and the idea that we had deeply lost sight of what we imagined the country to be. And I wanted them to understand how that happened, and ultimately perhaps that would also help us point a way to understanding how we would get out of it.
Mm-hmm. The questions are getting harder. Let's see. So how do you think we heal the divisions in the US and fix the toxicity of social media?
Well, I have a 5-point plan. No, I'm just kidding. I mean, look, the truth is there is a degree to which, and I've thought a lot about this problem of sort of, when you write a book of this kind, there is a temptation at the end to say, and now here is a convenient list of solutions.
Suggestions, yeah.
Yeah, and that never feels very satisfying to me as a reader. It feels somehow kind of like it's not as rigorous as the process of documentation. And I will for a moment lean on Albert Einstein, who said, if you give me an hour to talk about a problem, I'll spend 55 minutes describing it and 5 minutes proposing an idea about what might solve it. I think as a practical matter, I did come away with a couple of things that I think really would help. Number one is revive local news. And the reason I mention that is it serves even a greater function than providing some of the things we assume, like oversight of our local government and, community awareness of one person to the next. More important in a sense is that Arthur Miller, the playwright, used to describe a newspaper as a nation talking to itself. And on a local level, that's just deeply true, that it becomes a convening function of the mind. It's how you it's how you understand what your neighbor believes beyond the fact that your neighbor voted for Trump or Biden. It's sort of the fact that you both know that you have lead in the water. It's how you both know that you need that that you need a new mayor. It's how you both know this kind of thing. And that in the end is a binding agent. And the old ways of paying for news probably won't work forever. And in fact, we know that. But there are, and I should announce my priors here. My wife works for a nonprofit that is involved in the question of how do you revive local news. But that's one of them. And the other one that comes to me very distinctly is, and this is not abstract, it's just a literal fact, is that the power of national service, of civilian service or military service, but we'll focus on civilian for a second, is I think an underexploited asset in American life. And there is an idea right now that is part of the social safety bill that is making its way through Congress, includes this thing called the Civilian Climate Corps, based on, obviously the legacy of the New Deal. But there is this idea of putting people to work in league with one another. And the reason why this matters, I think, is just extraordinarily important, which is that when you put people inside of a project that is larger than themselves, it has, it almost is like, it is something that counteracts the toxicity and the seclusion and the ingrown quality of social media. I mean, social media is the most mislabeled technology we've ever created. It's actually, these are tools that promote a certain kind of narcissism. And if you can get people, particularly young people, working side by side, the data is very clear. It expands our sense of ourselves. It broadens our horizons, forgive the cliche, but allows us to imagine something bigger than what we're able to do alone. And it doesn't have to be mandatory. It can actually be more about creating a culture of moral glamour around it. JFK was able to create an idea that there was something hip and noble about service. And we haven't hit on the right formula for it. But climate is an opportunity. And I think if there is a way of getting some wind behind that, it may have larger dividend than simply the work that people are doing with their hands.
Yeah, great answer. I'm in furious agreement with you on the points of local media and the importance of it. Why do you think the radical right is so enraged? David Brooks has observed that the bobos, bourgeois, bohemians, the advantaged population, like many of us, define American culture. They own it. And the residents of Clarksburg aren't heard and haven't been. Do you think that's the source of the rage from that population?
I think that is a piece of it. And I think it's an astute question, because there is an element of the rage of essentially the unwatched. People feel as if they are not taken as part of the political calculation in this country. I mean, one of the most astute, or one of the most vivid descriptions of this that I've seen, there's a scholar named Joan Williams in California who has written about, as other scholars have written about, the hidden injuries of class, but she has a wonderful, very kind of clear description of it, which is, if you think about the representations of working men and women in American life, and if you go into post offices from the 20s and 30s and 40s, these heroic images of men laboring and, heaving steel and carrying the nation on their back. And then you get to a couple generations later, and it's Archie Bunker, who is sort of raging against the changing of the culture. And eventually you get to Homer Simpson, who is drunk at work in a nuclear power plant, saved by his wife and his daughter. I mean, that the pop cultural trajectory was so dismissive that there was I'm not saying people voted for Trump because of The Simpsons, but I'm saying that there is an underlying awareness of, and that goes all the way back to what I was saying earlier about how, JFK came and sat and paid people the mind in 1960 of being there and listening. And there is one of the inspiring people I encountered, and I describe in the book, is a candidate for governor in West Virginia, a guy named Stephen Smith. And he ended up losing, but he's just incredibly interesting, because one of the things that he did was, I mean, talk about a willingness to go against the grain. He's a Democrat in West Virginia, which is a minority position, but he went out and he just listened to people. He went from town to town to town. He was part of this broader campaign. And I know we're right up against the end of our time, but if you want to find something kind of inspiring that's going on in West Virginia politics, look up this thing called West Virginia Can't Wait, which is a coalition of people who have decided, in effect, that that there is a third option besides tuning out or tuning into Trump, and that's kind of thrilling. And in the end, the technology is no more elaborate than just being willing to listen.
Great. Well, thank you so much. This was wonderful. Congratulations on the book. I think we're out of time, so I'll turn it back over to the Town Hall Seattle people.
Thanks, Eric. Hey, Eric, before we close out, I just want to say thanks to you, and I'm looking forward to reading your novel, and I appreciate the conversation tonight. It was really a lot of fun for me.
Thank you so much. Same. Appreciate it.
Hello, Eric. Thank you so much for leading that conversation. You guys are so entertaining together. I wish you had a talk show. And Evan, thank you so much for coming to Seattle in a way. So thank you for being with us tonight. And remember to buy a copy of the book from our partner bookseller, Third Place Books, which can be found in the chat under the link. Thank you guys so much. And everyone at home, have a great evening.
Thank you.
Good night.